Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest has written multiple books, including The Untold Story of Books, the mystery novels The Lost Gold of San Francisco, A Killing in Real Estate, and Killer Weed, and the sexuality advice book Sizzling Sex for Life and the Cure for Premature Ejaculation. Additionally, he has written articles about sexuality, co-written books with other authors, and writes 2 Substack newsletters. His name is Michael Castleman, and my interview with Michael will follow the teleportation sound. Due to discussion of sexuality in this episode, listener discretion is advised. Michael Castleman, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I'm Michael Castleman. I've been an author for almost 50 years. I've written 19 books. My most recent one, my latest release, is called The Untold Story of Books, A Writer's History of Publishing. And I'm also a longtime magazine writer. I just spent my life wrestling with the written word.
Your most recent book, as you mentioned moments ago, is called The Untold Story of Books. Without spoiling too much of that book, what is it about?
It's about the 600-year evolution of the book business. As an author, I hang out with a lot of authors. I go to publishing conferences. I go to writer conferences. And the view that gets presented of the book business is always sort of mythological and mysterious. It's like no one really understands the book business. And people who say they do, their arguments, I was just never persuaded. So 40 years ago, I began researching the book business, its history, and how it actually developed and evolved. And in 2005, it became clear that the transition to digital publishing was not just some new wrinkle in the same old thing, but was an entirely new business model for books publishing and selling. And so I started to investigate this transformation, and I very quickly learned that there had been 3 book businesses, and we were just entering the 3rd one. So really, The Untold Story of Books is a sort of biography of the book publishing business, specifically written for authors and aspiring authors who are confused about publishing, and for book lovers, the millions and millions of book lovers who love books, love to read, and just wonder about the industry that produces them.
You mentioned the current digital age of the book industry as kind of the 3rd era of the book industry. What were the first 2, and what was the rough cutoff point between the first and the 2nd era?
Well, the first book business was founded by Gutenberg in 1450 when he invented the printing press and started printing books. And the entire history of the book publishing business is really it tracks the history of printing technology. And so Gutenberg had a small hand-operated press. Printing was a cottage industry. It was a cottage industry all over the world, though, because there were printers everywhere within 100 years of Gutenberg's invention. But they all printed books pretty much the way Gutenberg did. And 250 years after Gutenberg, Benjamin Franklin used a sort of souped-up version of Gutenberg's press to print his newspapers, magazines, and books. That model, the Gutenberg press model, lasted until around 1870, when all of a sudden printing presses changed from hand-operated items into these large steam-driven industrial printing presses that could print books in the blink of an eye, that were much faster than Gutenberg and Franklin's presses were. And that was the launch of the second book business. So Gutenberg from Gutenberg to 1870, that was the first book business. 1870 to 2000 was the second book business. And in the second book business, industrial printing just could print so many books, and the presses themselves were incredibly complicated to operate. And so printers who in Gutenberg's and Franklin's era were printers, and they were also publishers and booksellers, those occupations diverged, and printers focused on just managing their presses. And a whole new class of people rose up who were the new publishers. And most of those publishing companies developed in the early 20th century and sort of matured by around 1920. And that's when Simon & Schuster was founded in 1924 and Random House in 1925. The 20th century was dominated by industrial printing and the print and the publishing companies who numbered several dozen in the 20s and 30s, but now they've all bought each other up, and now there are only 5 of them. And the second book business ended around the millennium when digital technology completely transformed printing again. And all of a sudden, you didn't need big industrial presses anymore. I mean, they're still used, and some, huge bestsellers are still printed on them. But since the year 2000, many books aren't printed at all. They're digital books, they're ebooks. You read them on Kindle or on your phone. And the books that do still get printed on paper are often printed using what's known as print on demand, which is digital publishing, which is a very efficient way to produce small runs cheaply. On industrial presses, it's not economical to publish a run of less than about 1,000 copies. But using print on demand and digital printing equipment, you can knock off 25 copies of a book, and it's reasonably economical. So we are now in the third book business, which is digital publishing, which was preceded by industrial publishing, which was preceded by cottage industry hand crank presses. So that's what the third book business is. And it started around 2000, and it matured. It's matured about 2010, and that model sort of is now we see what that model is now that we're 25 years into the third book business.
I have one more question about the Untold Story of Books, and it's about the companion Substack newsletter to your book, which is called Beyond the Untold Story of Books. What types of articles can readers expect from that Substack newsletter?
Well, they can expect to see a lot of material that the publisher cut out of the book. The book that I turned in was about 75,000 words long, and the publisher, as they were very nice and they were very professional, and they cut my manuscript by about 20,000 words. So one thing that people will see in the Substack Beyond the Untold Story of Books is a lot of the material that got cut from the book that I still think is good, and I think it's relevant to readers and writers. And then, I stopped the text of the Untold Story of Books was pretty much set in concrete about a year ago. And things keep happening since then, and I keep following the publishing industry. And so some of what's in the Substack newsletter are new developments of things that have happened since the text was locked for the book.
In addition to the Untold Story of Books, you've written 3 mystery novels: The Lost Gold of San Francisco, A Killing in Real Estate, and Killer Weed. Without spoiling too much about your mystery novels, what are each of them about?
Well, they're all set in San Francisco. They all involve some San Francisco history. I live in San Francisco, and I love my hometown. And so the books have a very strong sense of place and a strong sense of history of that place. And, I've spent my career as a journalist, basically. And so the protagonist, the sleuth in these books, is an amateur sleuth. He's a journalist. He's not a private investigator. He's not a police officer. He's a newspaper reporter who gets sucked into sordid, juicy, violent, bloody mysteries that take place in my town.
You're also a sexuality writer, having written a pair of books, Sizzling Sex for Life and The Cure for Premature Ejaculation, as well as the Substack newsletter Great Sex Guide and numerous articles about sexuality for various publications. I'll start with the books. Without spoiling too much about both of your books about sexuality, what are each of them about?
I've spent my career mostly as a health and sexuality writer, and I cover sex research and sex therapy and psychology of relationships and sexuality. And so the Sizzling Sex for Life is the only book that considers all common sexual issues throughout the lifespan. And so it begins with the sexual implications of circumcision of infant boys, and it goes through all of the common sexual issues and dilemmas that people face right through old age, and it ends with the growing phenomenon of partner sex in nursing homes. And so it's really about sex throughout the lifespan, and whatever stage of life you're in, there is at least one chapter that deals with the challenges that you may be facing. The Cure for Premature Ejaculation is a small e-pamphlet that premature ejaculation is men's number one sex problem. Erection difficulties get most of the press, but in fact, if you look at the numbers, in every age demographic of men over about 15, premature ejaculation is the number one sex problem. And the good news about PE is that in about 95% of cases, it's fairly easily cured permanently without drugs, without doctors, without therapy. You can read this self-help booklet and learn the sex therapy program that is proven to give men bomb-proof ejaculatory control, and a whole lot of men really want that.
What motivates you to write about sexuality, and how important is sex positivity and sexual health?
What motivates me is that sex is a central element of life, and it's one of life's great pleasures. And it is also very fraught for a lot of people because of political and religious views about sexuality and its rightful place in our lives. And I'm political. I'm a political person, and I see sexuality as a very political subject. I mean, you just have to look at the current election with the controversy over access to abortion and women's ability or lack thereof to make their own healthcare decisions. I mean, sex is part of our lives every day, and it's usually compartmentalized, and it's not discussed in polite circles. But the fact is that tens of millions of people are very preoccupied with sexuality, and often with their perceived inability to perform and enjoy it the way they would like to. And so my mission with my sexuality writing is to help people have more pleasure in life and less guilt and shame about sex.
I'm going to mention for our listeners, this episode is going to be uploaded after the 2024 presidential election here in the United States. But this interview is being recorded before that election. So as of this recording, we don't know who's going to win the presidential election. Now I'm going to move on to my next question here. Aside from your books about sexuality, you've written or co-written numerous books about other health-related topics. Without spoiling too much of some of your other health-related books, what are some of them about?
My biggest seller, a book I wrote, sold over 1 million copies, is called The Healing Herbs. It's now called The New Healing Herbs. It's in its fourth edition. And the New Healing Herbs takes a look at 125 commonly used herbal medicines in the United States, and then traces their historical use, what people believed about them, centuries ago, because most of these plants have been used for centuries, if not thousands of years. And so the book begins with looking at the traditional uses of these plants and then flips over to analyzing the scientific research about what plants actually do. And it turns out that the large majority of these 125 most popular medicinal plants do pretty much what everyone always thought they did, from thousands of years ago to today. And sometimes the plants don't do what. Sometimes the plants turn out to be a bust in a few cases, and in a surprising number of cases, medicinal plants do more for health or more health promoting than anyone ever thought. So it's really a folklore meets science look at herbal medicine, which is under the radar, but is very popular in the United States. Go to any health food store, and there's a whole aisle of medicinal herbs. And that's what the Healing Herbs helps people use herbs medicinally more intelligently and confidently and more effectively. And then I've written a couple of many other books. I wrote a book on the common cold. I wrote a book on Alzheimer's disease. I wrote a book on natural medicine, 30 different non-drug approaches to health. I've been a health writer for almost 50 years.
As you've written both books as well as articles for numerous publications, what are some publications you've written articles for, and how do you approach writing a book differently than how you approach writing an article?
During the late 20th century, which was the heyday of magazine publishing in this country, I wrote for dozens of magazines. I wrote for every women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, Red Book, Family Circle, Women's Day. I wrote for all the men's magazines. I wrote Playboy, Men's Health, Men's Journal. Some of your older readers, older listeners, I should say, some of the older people who tune in to your podcast may remember the Playboy Advisor, which was Playboy's sex advice column to young men. Well, I was the Playboy Advisor for 5 years in the 1990s, and I answered all the questions that came in. So I loved writing for magazines. The great thing about magazine writing is that it's demanding. It's not easy to do. But it's short. You can write it. You can take a week or so, write an article, and then kiss it goodbye and see it come out. With books are much more involved. I mean, magazine articles are like having a summer romance that's intense but brief. Books are like getting married. You really have to move in with the subject. You have to live with the subject. And it's challenging to engage in long form writing because there's a lot of decisions to make. I mean, the average book is 60,000 words, but choosing those 60,000 words generally involves somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million decisions about what words you're going to choose, what order, what subject, how you're going to handle the subject. There are just myriad decisions that go into it. And so the scale is much larger than the scale of writing magazine articles.
Regarding your books, are your books self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published, or did you use a combination of publishing methods for your books?
None of my books are self-published. I've always had a publisher, and all of my books that came out all of my books are would be called traditional publishing, where the publisher acquired the book and then published and released it. I have the Untold Story of Books is a little bit of a hybrid situation. A hybrid situation is where the author and publisher both contribute funds to publish and release the book. So on Untold Story of Books, I contributed some money to for the promotional effort of the release, and I'm happy to say that those promotional efforts have been reasonably successful. But the publisher paid to print the book, and so I've always been in what's now called the traditional publishing world, although the Untold Story of Books places tremendous emphasis on self-publishing and hybrid publishing, which is sort of pay-to-publish companies are called hybrid publishers, because self-publishers and hybrid publishers now publish a good 90% of books. I mean, there's 2 million books published every year, and traditional publishers only release a few 100,000 of them. So the large majority of books are either self-published or hybrid published. And so the Untold Story of Books places tremendous emphasis on the evolution, on the market situation that led to self-publishing and hybrid publishing, and with some advice to authors about how to do it.
Do you have a typical writing routine? And if so, what is that like for you?
I do. I've always been a morning person. And so I do some exercise first thing in the morning. I have breakfast and I go to work. And I work from about 10 o'clock to about 1 o'clock. And then after lunch, I do everything else in my life. And I may revise what I've written that day or previous days, but my composition, my creative time is in the morning from around 10 to around 1. But that's just me. I mean, every writer has a different routine. I know people who, write late at night. I know people who curl up on their beds in the afternoon and write cross-legged with a laptop in their lap. There's every writer figures out how to work this into their lives. And I've always been most comfortable as a morning person, so that's when I write, but that's just me.
My last question for this interview, what do you enjoy most about writing?
I love its meditative aspects. I love it's a meditation in a lot of ways, and it gets you into your head, and I love to crystallize thought. Writing requires a lot of discipline, which I like, and I love to see. I love to read, so I love to see words on paper, it's just what it's always been my thing. So I love to write, and it can be very frustrating, and it's not particularly financially rewarding for the vast majority of authors. But, we're always hoping that we'll be the next Stephen King, and somebody's going to be. And most writers think, well, why not me? So, I keep at it, and I like the discipline of it, and I like to practice it. It's what I like to do.
Michael, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an interesting and wonderful guest to interview.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for having me on. I love appearing.
It was wonderful to interview Michael, and I've subscribed to both of his Substack newsletters. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.